Zachary Taylor, a military hero with no political experience, took office in March of 1849. Though his presidency was cut short by his untimely death just 16 months into his administration, Taylor's brief time in office came at a crucial juncture in American history. In today's episode, we're going to look at the administration of Zachary Taylor and Millard Fillmore, examining the growing sectional divide over the expansion of slavery and how it impacted the election of 1852. Let's get started. The nation was on the brink of crisis. The debate over whether new territories acquired from Mexico should allow slavery had escalated to a fever pitch. This debate had divided the country, with radical Southern factions clashing with staunch abolitionists in the North. Initially, Taylor didn't address the issue of slavery in his inaugural address, leaving many to wonder how he would handle the brewing storm. However, over the next several months, his stance will become clear. He's going to urge California, which he also included the Mormons in Salt Lake, as well as New Mexico, territories that were applying for statehood, to go ahead and draft their constitutions and join the Union without waiting on Congress to make a decision on slavery. Taylor's expectation was that these new states would ban slavery. This is a move that is going to alarm his Southern supporters who felt betrayed. As California moved to join the Union as a free state, tensions soared. At the time, the Senate was evenly divided between free and slave states, and adding California and potentially other free states would tip the balance of power in favor of the North. The Southern states were outraged by this possibility and began to seriously discuss secession. Taylor, a firm believer in national unity, responded with an iron fist. He warned that he would personally lead an army against any state that attempted to secede. And as tensions reached a boiling point, we're going to see prominent leaders like Henry Clay, Daniel Webster, John C. Calhoun, and William H. Seward step in to see if they could possibly find a compromise that could keep the Union together. This period of intense political debate from January to September of 1850 saw the nation's most prominent figures locked in a bitter struggle. Henry Clay proposed a compromise that would include California as a free state, it would include a strict fugitive slave law, and it would establish territorial governments in Utah and New Mexico without any restrictions on slavery. Clay, Webster, and others hoped that the strong fugitive slave law, as well as the establishment of territorial governments in New Mexico and Utah, without any congressional prohibitions on the institution of slavery, would allow Southerners to accept California as a free state. And it did appeal to some Southerners who felt offended by the talks of secession in 1850, because it would put the federal government on record as the legal protector of slavery in the South. However, John C. Calhoun will oppose Clay's proposals, all the way up to his death on March 31st, 1850. Jefferson Davis, the son-in-law of President Zachary Taylor, took over Calhoun's Southern leadership in opposition to Clay's proposals. In the midst of this national debate, President Zachary Taylor also stood as a firm opponent of Senator Henry Clay's proposed compromise. Taylor, a former military leader known for his decisiveness, felt like the concessions for the Southern states were unnecessary and posed a threat to the Union. His steadfastness in his belief made him a major obstacle to the passage of what would become known as the Compromise of 1850. However, in a sudden and dramatic turn of events, President Taylor's life, and with it his influence on the nation's course, was cut short. On July 4th, 1850, after attending several Independence Day celebrations in the sweltering heat of Washington, D.C., the president decided to have a large amount of cherries and iced milk. Later that evening, the president fell ill with severe stomach pains, which doctors at the time described as cholera morbus, a broad term used for gastrointestinal distress. Despite the efforts of the physicians, Taylor's condition worsened over the next few days. The medical treatments of the time, including bloodletting and various other medicines, only seemed to exasperate his suffering. After intense pain, Taylor will pass away on July 9th, 1850, just 5 days after becoming ill. Taylor's death is going to shock the nation, and it's going to lead to widespread speculation, with some suggesting that he might have been poisoned. a theory that has since been largely debunked. Taylor's death had profound implications for the nation. His successor, Vice President Millard Fillmore, did not share Taylor's staunch opposition to the Compromise of 1850, and upon taking office, Fillmore is going to signal his support for the legislative package, which sought to address the issue of slavery and the tensions between North and South. This shift in leadership is going to prove to be pivotal, as Fillmore's willingness to engage in compromise facilitated the passage of the Compromise of 1850. This series of laws is going to temporarily calm the sectional tensions that threatened to tear the nation apart, delaying the outbreak of the Civil War by a decade. Upon taking office, Fillmore is going to quickly reshuffle Taylor's cabinet, bringing in members who more align with his pro-union, pro-compromise stance. This change in leadership is going to help push the compromise bills through Congress, but it's also going to highlight the deep divisions within the country. The Compromise of 1850 consisted of several key measures. California was admitted as a free state. Texas settled its border dispute with New Mexico. And New Mexico and Utah were allowed to decide on slavery through the use of popular sovereignty. Additionally, the Fugitive Slave Law was enacted, and the slave trade, although not slavery itself, was abolished in Washington, D.C. While Fillmore viewed the compromise as a success, many Americans saw this as a flawed solution. Abolitionists in the North were outraged by the Fugitive Slave Act, which required citizens to assist in the capturing of runaway slaves. Southern pro-slavery advocates were also upset with the compromise because they felt like it restricted the expansion of slavery. Fillmore's attempts to enforce the Fugitive Slave Act is only going to deepen the divide between North and South, leading to unrest and the weakening of the Whig Party, of which Fillmore is a member. Despite the domestic turmoil, Fillmore's presidency also saw significant foreign policy actions. He sought to expand American trade without engaging in entanglements outside of the Western Hemisphere. One of his most notable moves was the dispatching of Commodore Matthew Perry to Japan, which eventually will open the isolated nation to international trade. Fillmore is also going to take a strong stance in defending American interests in Hawaii and Central America, ensuring that Europe does not gain a foothold in these regions. As Fillmore's presidency came to a close, the nation was still grappling with the issues of slavery and sectionalism. The Compromise of 1850, while it temporarily averted disaster, failed to provide a lasting solution. The Whig Party, which was deeply fractured over the compromise, failed to provide a unified front in the election of 1852. Meanwhile, the Democrats were gearing up for this election, ready to exploit the weaknesses of their opponent. Fillmore's enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act and his inability to reconcile the demands of the North and South weakened his support within his own party. This set the stage for the election of 1852, where these unresolved issues once again came to the forefront, ultimately leading to the dissolution of the Whig Party and the rise of new political forces in the years leading up to the American Civil War. By the time the 1852 election rolled around, Millard Fillmore was exhausted from the political battles that had defined his presidency, particularly the Compromise of 1850. The criticism that he drew for his support of the Fugitive Slave Act made it clear that his chances of winning the presidency in 1852 were slim. Fillmore showed very little interest in running for another term. He avoided campaigning altogether and was silent about his intentions. In March of 1851, Fillmore is even going to plant a story in a newspaper using an editor aligned with him that he was going to retire from office. Shortly thereafter, his Secretary of State, Daniel Webster, announced his candidacy. Instead of being upset, Fillmore sympathized with Webster's long-held desire to hold the office. However, he saw this as the final straw and attempted to remove himself from consideration altogether. But his own cabinet members are going to convince him to stay in the race. The Whig Party was in disarray, with deep divisions over the issue of slavery. None of the leading candidates, Fillmore, Webster, or General Winfield Scott, could rally the party behind them. Fillmore was unpopular with the abolitionists who were upset with his enforcement of the Fugitive Slave Act. Webster was viewed as too old and too unwell. And many Southern Whigs distrusted General Winfield Scott because of his actions during the Tariff and Secession dispute in 1832, while he served as President Jackson's personal emissary. When the Whigs gathered for their convention in Baltimore in mid-June of 1852, the party was deeply divided on who to nominate. While Fillmore led the early balloting, Webster's stubborn refusal to release his delegates to Fillmore prevented Fillmore from gaining the nomination. And the balloting dragged on and on and on, and it frustrated these delegates to the point where many of them began to defect to Winfield Scott. Finally, on the 53rd ballot, Winfield Scott will secure the party's nomination, effectively signaling the end of the Whig Party as a national force. With strong Southern opposition to the nomination of Scott, many of these Southern Whigs abstained from voting altogether, while others threw their support to the Democratic nominee, Franklin Pierce. The Democratic Party faced its own set of challenges in the election of 1852. It was deeply divided with no clear frontrunner. Leading candidates like James Buchanan, Lewis Cass, William Marcy, and Stephen A. Douglas all faced strong opposition from different factions within the party. As the Democratic National Convention dragged on, it became very clear that none of these men would receive the two-thirds majority needed to receive the party's nomination. After 34 ballots, the party is going to turn to a dark horse candidate in Franklin Pierce. A relative unknown, Pierce was a pro-slavery Northerner who could appeal to both sides of the debate. His political machine in New Hampshire had been quietly working the convention floor, particularly amongst the Southern delegates. On the 35th ballot, Pierce's name was placed in nomination, and he began to gain traction. His lack of a strong political reputation actually worked in his favor. Having few enemies and no significant controversies, he was a candidate who could be molded to fit the party's needs. Pierce's easygoing personality, good looks, and status as a Mexican-American War veteran made him an attractive choice. On the 48th ballot, the Democrats handed Pierce the nomination, with Senator William Rufus King of Alabama suggested as his running mate. The 1852 election turned personal quickly, with both candidates refusing to substantially discuss the party's platforms. The Whigs are going to resurrect old stories of Pierce being this coward who fainted in the Mexican-American War, and they're also going to accuse Pierce of being an alcoholic. In response, the Democrats are going to dredge up an old tale of when Winfield Scott allegedly refused a duel with war hero and former president Andrew Jackson, portraying Winfield Scott as a would-be military dictator. Interestingly, Franklin Pierce did very little to campaign, and a lot of this has to do with his wife Jane Pierce, who was deeply opposed to his return to politics. In fact, when she heard about his candidacy, she fainted. And his decision to stay out of the public eye probably helped his cause because it kept him away from the fray of the personal attacks. He instead is going to leave the electioneering up to others, including his old college friend and famous author Nathaniel Hawthorne, who's going to pen this very flattering biography of Pierce. In the end, Franklin Pierce will win the election of 1852 with ease, in what one newspaper will call the most ludicrous, ridiculous, and uninteresting elections ever. Pierce carried a majority of the states, including both northern and southern ones, while Scott only managed to win 4 states, even losing his native Virginia. With majorities now in both houses of Congress, there were high hopes that Pierce's presidency might help cool the growing sectional tensions. However, Pierce's presidency will be marked by personal tragedy. Just 2 months before his inauguration, Pierce will lose his only surviving child in a tragic train accident, which he and his wife both witnessed. Jane Pierce will never recover from this tragedy, retreating into a reclusive existence within the White House. The administration was somber and cold, with very few social functions. Visitors to the White House will describe it as a cheerless place, reflecting the deep sadness that had settled over the Pierce family. Pierce's presidency, which began with such high hopes, soon became one of the most tragic and ineffective in American history. Distracted by personal grief and facing the continuing sectional crisis, Pierce struggled to navigate through the tumultuous political landscape of the 1850s. The 1852 election was a turning point in American history, a moment when the old political order began to crumble and the seeds of future conflict were sown. Pierce's victory marked a new chapter in American history. Unfortunately, this is a chapter filled with sorrow and difficulty. As we look back, we can see how the events of this election set the stage for the turbulent years that follow. That's all the time we have for today. Thanks for joining me. We'll see you next time.